Hi everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about AEM and web caching. A few months ago, one of my clients had this conversation about caching, and someone said caching is really hard, it's really complicated, and then someone said caching is really easy. I really wanted to break that conversation down at that time for my clients, but it wasn't exactly the right time. So tonight, let's gonna kind of talk through my understanding of all the caching stuff. What's best practice, how it actually works, has AEM architects, what do we think about, and if time allows, we'll dive into some of the more modern stuff that's available to us as well. All right, so with all things goes, with a sequence diagram, we'll just draw requester perspective to save time. So let's say browser, right? Typically these days they go to CDN. CDN typically holds your certificate, and this is the first CDN. And typically, sometimes client security team, they love it, right? They love their wave rules. They're not sure how Adobe CDN actually works. So most of the time you get stuck with a CDN that's not Adobe's native one. And then next one, just for simplicity's sake, let's say Adobe's Fastly CDN. And then this is where, right, you can kind of go through Adobe's documentation on bring your own CDN, and you can, basically literally do a CNAME over from this CDN to this CDN. I'm sorry, actually don't do a CNAME. You actually just map an origin from this CDN to this CDN. You follow Adobe's instructions. You kind of do their forward key, right, to make sure it's best practice. You kind of keep it locked down. Anyways, so we have client CDN. Well, name this client to Adobe's Fastly CDN. And here underneath, right, we have the dispatcher. For those of us who's been Adobe forever, right, this is important. And then under here, we have what's called Java layer. And that's typically there, and then kind of request bubbles up. This is typically the typical setup. We'll go from bottom up from now on. In terms of the Java layer, right, we have the publish server. And this layer, we haven't cached things here for a very long time, especially the cloud service where things are containerized. It's just really not recommended we cache things here anymore. And there's more on modern architectures that does the same solve. I remember caching here 10 years ago for e-commerce stuff because there's no better place to cache it at the time. But again, way more modern architecture available today. Anywho, so we have the Java publish layer, which doesn't typically cache anymore. However, it does something that's actually very important. Sometimes this Java publish layer sets the response header of cache control and maybe even surrogated cache control. And that matters because, well, dispatcher may pass it on or they might override it. Anyway, so this layer does something important. And then in the latest Adobe Content Fragment model and GraphQL builder, basically, for headless AEM, you can actually set a lot of the cache headers, and assuming that dispatcher passes it along, and can pass it on to the higher layer. All right, the dispatcher layer is very important for those of us been doing AEM forever. There's the .ini file, right, that kind of manages cache control. Unlike any of the modern stuff above the stack, this layer totally ignores whatever AEM publish layer does, right? There's the .ini file that configures cache control, which is fantastic, right? So the actual caching logic of the dispatcher is configured .ini. And then important thing to note here is that the dispatcher file has the capability to set its own response header, right, to the higher tier, how we're responding with the response header, or you can just literally pass it along, right? You don't have to set or unset it. You can just, hey, cool, just keep the same response header and pass it over. And then has those of us with configured dispatcher forever, yes, those headers are cacheable. So you can literally cache headers here as well, which is great. Dispatcher was certainly great for its time. Next, right, we have the Adobe CDN. This layer really respects a few things. First, respects something called the surrogate cache control. That's for response headers. So for example, in the dispatcher, if you set a surrogate cache control, you'll absolutely respect it. It also respects cache control as well. So basically, instead of having a .ini file that configures any of this, right, you would just basically leverage the bottom two layers of response header, and that kind of configures this lovely layer. And then the client CDN is similar, right? You can override, or if it doesn't override, it's going to respect into whatever the bottom layer is. So the long story short, browser CDN, all CDNs respects the cache control of the layer below. It has the ability to override it for the layer above. And this is where it kind of gets complicated. It could be really simple. You could literally have the Java layer be passed through all the way to the browser, right? Or it depends on your cache control design. right? You can have the Java layer, response header cache control be changed by the dispatcher, then changed again by Adobe, then changed again by the client CDN, and browser sees the same one. So you can literally have a very simple design of caching, right? That all the way goes to the browser. Maybe you shouldn't. Or you can have a more complex caching. And certainly the requirements, all of that will be probably for a different video. Anyways, so that's how I like to think about Adobe's cache control in terms of Adobe CDN. And then, right, in more modern architecture, arguably, you shouldn't be caching things anymore here. So let's say we have a different box here. We have a, do not need to do this wide. Let's make it skinnier. Let's say we have something that's more decoupled, right? Where AEM is no longer a monolith. We'll just call this application. Right, and then here we then kind of have the capability to, instead of reverse proxying here, which we absolutely could, we could also just reverse proxy here, right? Here we have, potentially we have the database, right? In more application, we would, since this is a caching video, maybe we'll have a separate thing here called Redis, right? Maybe we check for Redis cache and stuff like that. One thing to note is that for caching, Adobe CDN actually does something I found that's really, really cool. Adobe CDN actually does something that checks caching in the background. All right, so it has this capability to basically check for staleness, which is great. I always love this feature. So that means the response time is always fast. If you have that set for a certain time, and what the staleness caching means that you'll fetch, right? You'll kind of return a cache response when it's stale. And then later on, right, in the dispatcher, Adobe's Fastly CDN would then make a request to the dispatcher and fetch the data, right? Let's say it takes a second to return. Once the cache expires, right, it kind of gets done without the client, browser, or anyone ever seeing it. So to summarize this short video for everyone real quick, caching can be hard because there's many layers that control it. And then browser even something that's also can be hard as well, right? And browser also respect literally the same header, cache control. So if you have browser cache control, right, set to public, right, browser absolutely looks at that and then figures out what to do. So when you have stuff that's caching or CQ caching, could be any of these layers. So one tip and trick I had, I guess I have 3 hints or tips to share with this video. The first one is really kind of just documenting and testing your caching layer. And then so each layer has the capability of setting the header, right, and modifying it and respecting it and reacting to it, right? It's like a big scientist experiment. So how I've kind of solved that for my past clients, right, is in AEM, just kind of have, each row be whatever the path pattern you want it to be, right? Then you kind of document exactly what you're doing for each layer. And I kind of like each layer to be documented in 2 columns. So the first column kind of talks about the behavior, right? Like what it's actually doing, how it's actually getting cached, we're not getting cached. And the second is, hey, what is it actually returning, right? And then again, dispatcher, same thing. What is it actually doing in the .ini file? Okay, what is it actually returning to the higher layer? Fastly, same thing, right? What is it actually doing with surrogate control? What is actually returning to the higher layer, right? What is Akamai, Azure Front Door, whatever CDN is doing, their actual behavior, right? And what is passing on to the higher layer? What is browser doing, right? Well, this one doesn't really apply. Well, AI generated this, but yeah, so this one wouldn't necessarily apply, but browser behavior is something you should absolutely document. The second tip I'll kind of give everyone is that it's important to be able to test each layer without, being to validate it. You don't need like a lot of test cases, right? This isn't something that you should need to do a lot potentially. But anyways, this is something that you'll definitely want to think about testing and validating in its own layer, which is important. And then the third thing I would just kind of tips and tricks in my years of doing this is don't wait till the last minute, right? So this is where if you're building this, right, just like, oh, okay, validate this, right? Okay, cool. You have, let's do it fastly, neat, okay. Stage and prod, sometimes they only do, CDN there. Let's make sure it gets validated, right? I think a lot of the reasons why caching gets left out of the stack is because folks, they literally do it the day or the week before go live, right? That's when things get falls apart a little bit and things don't get documented or whatever the reason might be. Well, thank you for watching.